Welcome to this Breathe Zoom call. We're so glad that you joined us today. This call is for parents of children of any age who have mental health challenges, and we hope that you find support and information and community every time that you join us. If you're new, if you don't really know that much about Breathe, I'm not a mental health professional. I'm a mom. I'm a mom of a beautiful young man named Matthew who struggled with all sorts of mental health challenges. He started when he was 7, and it was very difficult as a parent to watch those dark clouds of serious depression and other mental health challenges settle over his tiny little shoulders as a 7-year-old boy. And probably some of you know our story that culminated with mental illness being the cause of him taking his life on April 5th, 2013. And ever since then, I've just had a passion in my heart to care for other parents who walked a similar journey that we have, to provide resources and community that we didn't have. We often felt alone and isolated, and that most people didn't understand us, even though we were surrounded by family and friends who cared about us. It was just an isolated, alone, sometimes frightening, painful journey as our child suffered and as his illness grew worse and worse through the years. So to be able to have a place called Breathe that you can join in, we started it in 2019, and the intent is to be able to gather either in these Zoom calls or online retreats. There's a private Facebook page that some of you that may be how you even encountered Breathe, is on that Facebook page, but also some in-person retreats. And every time we get together, the whole idea is so that we can face the reality of the mental illness that our children live with and the toll that takes on us, to be able to look at the reality, to grieve it, and to rebuild our hope so that we can keep going for ourselves and for our families. Just want to let you know, coming up in 2023, another in-person retreat for moms. Hope to launch our first in-person retreat for couples. That will be, a small retreat and limited spaces, so stay tuned for those dates. But our next Zoom call will be December 8th, so put that on your calendar and know that we'll get to see each other again, really just in a couple of months. So today I'm incredibly thrilled, honestly, just thrilled to pieces to be able to introduce Dr. Bruce Perry to you. He is a professional. His professional bio is in the chat, so you can see all the particulars. But the bottom line is he is an highly experienced, highly trained neuroscientist who specializes in child trauma, works directly with children in their parents. And he's just this amazing man. What I've learned from him in the last few years, in fact, I always tell him this every time I see him, that he's changed my life, because truly the things that I learned from him about the brain and that the way the brain responds in stress has made me want to redo every single one of my relationships. It made me want to be a better wife and a better mom and a better friend. And I think you're going to benefit from Dr. Perry's wisdom. His book that is so powerful, well, he's written several, but his latest book came out last year, is What Happened to You, that he co-wrote with Oprah. And it is just amazing. I think what I want you to know more than anything about Dr. Perry is he's not just a fantastic practitioner or a brilliant scientist. He is a compassionate and kind man who has great empathy for people who are suffering. So he has great empathy for you as a parent, empathy for your child or your children. And so everything that he says to us comes from that place of deep empathy and compassion. And I think you're going to love him. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bruce Perry. So here is Dr. Perry. And as I already told you, I just think he is an amazingly kind and compassionate man who happens to be an incredible mental health professional, a neuroscientist, and a trauma specialist. But I thought what he had to say to us as Breathe parents was unique with his understanding of the brain. And some of you may or may not be familiar with his work, but his latest book is a book that came out last year. It's called What Happened to You, and he co-authored it with Oprah, and it's subtitled Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing. And it is a fantastic book. I have a friend who listened to it on the audio rather than just reading it. And she said it was like just having Oprah and Dr. Perry in her ear for hours at a time. And it was just so encouraging. Highly recommend you get that book. But what I want to talk about is the fact that so many of us who have children with serious mental illness live with chronic trauma, chronic stress. There's the chronic trauma and stress of our children, what they experience, and then the chronic trauma and stress we experience watching our children. And so I thought that it would be really helpful to understand what happens in the brain in chronic stress. Sometimes there's violence in our homes, and what that does and how that changes the brain. And I just don't know anybody who understands this better than Dr. Perry. So Dr. Perry, I know you have this whole treasure trove of slides that I've gotten to see several times. I've only seen bits and pieces of them, but what I love about it is you take science, and I'm not a science person, but you make science understandable, you make it applicable. And I have to say, I don't think I said this yet, but you guys, Dr. Perry's work has changed my life. His work, that is not an exaggeration. That's not flattery. It's the truth.
Wow.
What I've learned from your research and your work has made me a better mom. It's made me a better wife. I'm a better friend. I'm a better human being because of what you have explained and made within my reach. And that's why, you guys, this is why I want you to hear what Dr. Perry has to say, because I think you'll experience that too. So Dr. Perry, just jump in with some of your incredible slides and teachings about the brain and how it works, and set us up for this conversation.
Great. Well, first of all, Kay, thank you very much for having me on this show. And I always feel, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get my head through the door after we have this conversation. You're so flattering. And I'm really, really happy to talk about this, because this is an area where the mental health world is not paying enough attention to the needs of the families who are caring for children or young adults or adults with mental illness. And we see it every day in our clinical work. We know that, first of all, we see exhaustion, just physically exhausting. And then there's the emotional exhaustion. And then there's the chaotic impact it has on the rhythms of your everyday life. And so it's just a heartbreaking set of experiences that families have when there's serious mental illness with somebody they love. And, there's a couple things that I think that we can do to help this. One is understanding. We have found, and a lot of other people have found, that simply understanding why something is happening makes your level of discomfort and stress go down a little bit. Now, it doesn't, the explanation rarely solves it.
Right.
But just knowing that there's a mechanism, or there's some explanation for this, because a lot of the characteristics of sort of explosive problems with mental illness are that they seem unpredictable and they seem out of the blue. And you're always trying to figure out, was it because I did this, or did I do that? Or last night he slept really well and we had hot chocolate at 7, so maybe we should give him hot chocolate. And then you make hot chocolate for him, and then he throws it at you and says, I hate you. Yes. And you're like, what the hell? Excuse my language. But you're like, it leads to this sort of pervasive confusion and almost a level of fear about, I'm walking on eggshells. I have to say the right thing. I have to do the right thing. And this is trauma.
Yes.
The changes in your body are very similar to the changes in the brain and body of people who have exposure to combat or have some other form of easily observable traumatic event. Now, and again, the world sees somebody who experiences a car accident or combat or whatever and goes, oh, you may have some issues. How can we help? They don't see what's going on in your home. And so not only are you experiencing this, you're very often alone in that. And you're
Absolutely.
carrying this all by yourself. And we mentioned this before we started taping, that if the child that was having these problems, that was ill and struggling in your family, had cancer, the whole community would marshal to help you. But because it's schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or substance abuse, people are uncomfortable. You feel shamed. It's just a mess. And so part of
I was just going
yeah,
to say, along with that is what in talking to, well, just thinking of our own experience with serious mental illness with our son, Matthew, and then talking to hundreds and hundreds of parents in the last 10 years. What I hear, just to amplify that, is the level of shame it's even hard to define, because it's so great that because what happens behind closed doors in our families sometimes is we just don't want anybody else to know. We don't know what else to do about it. We're just trying to, as you say, walk on the eggshells, keep everything tamped down, do whatever we can to keep those explosions from happening, or those bad, it's more than a bad mood, but those dips in stability that are so pervasive and rock the whole family. If other people who don't have someone who has serious mental illness, if somebody else knew that, we just have this sense that they would think we were the worst parents in the world, that we had the most terrible family. The judgment and the shame and the stigma around living or loving somebody who has serious mental illness, most of us are just not comfortable talking about it.
Yeah. And it's heartbreaking, and it leads to this cycle of despair.
Yes.
Not oddly enough, but the more you feel shamed, the less you talk to people, and then the less you share with people. Now, what we know, and we've talked about this before, Kay, is that human beings are social creatures. When you are in connection with another person and you're getting the signals that you belong, I'm there, I'm listening, you feel seen, that makes you feel better. That quiets your stress response system. It gives the reward centers in your brain activation, and all of a sudden you've got a little bit of health, a little bit of healing. And again, if you have the benefit of having a community of people who are doing that for you, you can make significant progress in, number one, dealing with ongoing chaos, and number two, healing from past problems. But if you are not talking to people about this and you feel embarrassed about connecting and getting help, you get more isolated. And when you're more isolated, you're less capable of dealing what's going on. And so you get worse and worse and worse and worse. And it's a big problem. And part of our strategy as a working group to help with that is to give information. We really think teaching people about this will help them better understand their kids, better understand themselves, better understand the importance of reaching out and creating a community of helpers who will be part of your life. And it really kind of boils down to, from our perspective, teaching people a little bit about the brain. So I'm going to go ahead and show you some slides.
That's great.
And the first slides I'm going to show are a little bit, are kind of sciencey. Whoops, where did I go? I'm going to have to press the right button here. I still have my learner's permit on Zoom. I haven't passed the full test yet.
We should all have PhDs in Zoom by now.
Exactly. So here's my screen, and I'm going to make it big. And hopefully you will see that.
Yeah, it's great.
Now, what you see right here is an upside down triangle, which we use as a representation of the human brain. Now, obviously, you know that the brain is not an upside down triangle. In fact, the brain this is some of our neuroimaging work that shows you a little bit more of a complicated perspective of the brain. And I can actually make this kind of move around, and you can see different colors. And really what this is looking at the activity of different parts of the brain. And you can see the red things are really active and the dark blue things are not very active. And this is, the brain's very complicated. It's not an upside down triangle. In fact, it's so complicated that we can't even begin to comprehend it. There are a lot of people that are studying this, and there's a lot of progress being made, and I'm hopeful that we'll continue to learn more, but it's really complex. And the challenge we have is that, number one, how do we teach people the things that we do know without overwhelming them with factoids and jargon? And number two, how do we take the things that we are learning and make them applicable and useful in everyday life? And so that's a big part of what our working group has been doing. And so we end up using what we call heuristics. And a heuristic is basically like a model. It's a model, it's a tool. And the primary tool that we use about the brain is this upside down triangle. And what we're trying to show here is that if you kind of look at these labels, you don't really have to pay attention to this, but these are different big component parts of the brain. And what you should focus on, though, is that they're organized in a hierarchical way. So there's a bottom of the brain and there's a top of the brain. And the top of the brain is the part of our brain that is most uniquely human. This is a part of the brain that allows us to think about the past and to anticipate the future and to make words, to create language, and our values and our beliefs and all the stuff that we kind of learn in school is stored up in the cortex, this human part of our brain. And as the brain develops, what happens is, it's interesting. The human brain is very different than the human pancreas, for example. So at birth, your pancreas is just a little version of what the big pancreas is when you're an adult. It's doing the same stuff, but that's not true about the brain. So the brain of a newborn, is only organized in these lower areas fully. You do have these areas, but they're not organized yet. And so the newborn can regulate body temperature and respiration, but the newborn can't think about the past and anticipate the future and have language. So the higher parts of the brain are not yet organized. They're organizing, but they're not yet organized. And as the brain develops, it develops from the bottom up and kind of from the inside out. And by the time you get to be a young adult, you've got a brain that's pretty well organized. Now, there's a little bit more to go. It's not completely organized, but it's pretty well organized. Now, the reason this is important, and the reason, one of the major things that we talk to people about with this brain and this model, and that this seems a little far afield from what we're going to talk about in a minute, but trust me, if you hang in there for 3 more minutes, it'll make sense. So in the lowest part of our brain, we have these neurotransmitter networks, and everybody who has a child or a loved one with mental illness has heard of serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine. Most of these individuals have been given medications to try to help with their symptoms, and almost all of those medications work on one or more of these neurotransmitter networks to try to change their activity, make them be more smoothly regulated, and so forth. Now, the reason that these systems are so important is that collectively, if you put them all together, all those systems that are in the lower parts of the brain, collectively, they reach every part of the body, and either directly through the autonomic nervous system. These are literally nerves that go from the brain out into the body, or through the hormonal systems, the neuroendocrine system. And you guys have heard of cortisol and that kind of thing. That's this system. And then also, even down to the level of our white blood cells, our immune system is influenced by these core regulatory networks in the brain. And all of the input from your body, how much oxygen you have, where you are in space, how much glucose or blood or sugar you have in your blood, all of that is continually being fed up into these lower parts of the brain, so that if you need to do something to get more oxygen, like stop running up the stairs, it'll tell your brain to just stop going upstairs, sit down for a little while. And in the meantime, I'm going to take deeper breaths and I'm going to take more frequent breaths. So there's this stressor of running up and consuming oxygen. And then there's the stress response, which is mediated by these systems that then tell the other parts of the body what to do to deal with that stressor. So because of this architecture and because of the nonstop input from our senses and from the inside of our body, these core regulatory networks end up being the backbone of the stress response. And because these systems are changeable, every system in the brain, all neurons in the brain are changeable. You've probably heard of the term neuroplasticity. Certain patterns of activity will make these systems either get more active or less active, more reactive or less reactive. And one of the big issues with a lot of people who have serious mental illness is that these systems are out of sync. They're out of whack. Sometimes they're overly reactive. Sometimes they're not reactive enough. And everybody, if you think about the person, your loved one, about how sometimes the tiniest little thing will make them blow up. And then sometimes all kinds of effort and initiation doesn't make them move at all. You can't engage them one bit. So that kind of, that being out of sync originates, we believe, from how these systems are regulated. Now, one of the key things about these systems is that if you end up experiencing lots of stress, and the stress might be watching when the police have to come into your home because your child's been violent and they have to take your child out of the home screaming and kicking, and your child's yelling, "I hate you." That's heartbreakingly stressful, but you had to. He was on his way to hurting himself or hurting others, and you were at wit's end. But that activates your stress response. And when your stress response gets activated like that, this is kind of what happens, is that in comes input. Oh, he's yelling, he's throwing things, you're afraid, you need help. And these systems in the lower part of the brain start to activate. They'll activate your stress response system, and certain parts of your brain that are likely to help you with that get activated. But the other thing is, other parts of the brain that aren't actively involved in that process will get shut down. And so you start to have this kind of shutdown at the top part of your brain. You get so overwhelmed, you can't think clearly. You just don't know what to do. You almost feel paralyzed at times. And that's because under threat, there's this state-dependent shutdown in the top part of your brain. Now, if this happens again and again and again and again, and like it has for many of you, and like it has for many of your loved ones who are struggling with serious mental illness, the brain starts to make these neuroplastic changes, and your cortex will be shut down all the time. And so what happens is you find yourself less efficient at work, and making sort of these, you forget appointments and you forget where you're supposed to be. And then that compounds the stressor in your life. And you literally realize that if my world is smaller, I make fewer mistakes. If my world is smaller, it's easier to get by. And pretty soon the inertia of this leads you to 3 weeks, 4 weeks without seeing anybody you love. And then you're in this is where the compounding secondary problems related to your child's serious mental illness can cause problems for you. You literally develop like post-traumatic stress disorder. But it wasn't combat. It was trying to parent a child with serious mental illness. And so often we feel guilty if we slow down, if we reach out for help, if we take time off, if we address our problem at the same time that our child is having problems. And this is just this toxic impact of having someone with serious mental illness in your home and having few tools to help you. And the major tool in helping anybody with this is a group of other people who love you, who care for you, who know a little bit about mental health issues, who, and even if they don't, who can be supports for you. And anyway, I could go on and on about this, but the key is, in our work, and what we find is that if you can help somebody, if you can get to these systems in the brain and you can try to regulate them a little bit in healthy ways, then you can get back to a clearer, if you will, a clearer head. You can make better decisions. And then even more importantly, this part of your brain that's involved in forming relationships becomes more open too. You're more capable of reaching out, and you're more capable of benefiting from a relational interaction when somebody does reach out. Because a lot of times there are times when people will reach out a little bit, and you're either, like we talked earlier, you may feel shamed, or you may feel just not ready for it, tired, exhausted.
Yeah.
Anyway, and I've talked a lot. Let me just stop sharing, and Kay, let's talk a little bit about some of this.
Well, yeah, just several. I have not ever heard you use that expression before, but boy, was it an apt one. You said that under this kind of stress and tension that we can tend to make our world smaller, because that becomes more manageable if there's less energy requirement on my part to interact, or less details to manage. You alluded to it, but one of the moms I was talking to this week said, yes, there's be value in seeing my child's, brain and the effects of all this trauma over time, but I bet you my brain has changed.
Oh, absolutely.
And this is a woman who has a child who is at least in his 40s. So we're talking a very long time of serious mental illness that she has walked through. And she just said, I think my brain would show dramatic changes. And you kind of alluded to that. And so what happens over time too? Let's just keep talking about the parents right now, and then we'll go back and talk about the children. But when you have a loved one, as you say, you've witnessed them being taken out by him. Maybe it's depression. Maybe they weren't, maybe they weren't violent, but it was a scary situation. And when you've witnessed that, or you've watched your child, you spot them on the street because they're homeless. You're out there and you see them, and you're trying to fight, that repeated kind of thing. How can a parent just manage their own stress? You talked about community.
Yeah.
But you talked to us a little bit about the self-regulation. We know, I want to talk about what we can do for the other people in our lives, but how can we help regulate ourselves to face a challenge that may or may not ever change? In fact, it may get worse over time rather than better. And
so let me just, I want to make a tiny little comment on the first part of what you were saying. Is if you take parents who have a child diagnosed with cancer, and you have the child go through traditional cancer treatments, some of which are painful, but there's always sort of the fear that, wow, this could be, this could be fatal. And what you find is, with that group of parents, with just that issue, and it's not to minimize that in any way, so upwards towards 40% of those parents end up with diagnosable post-traumatic stress disorder.
Wow.
And so if you look at how many parents from that develop that active set of problems, that every single parent that lives with and tries to help an individual who's got active serious mental illness, where there's much less predictable outcomes, and it's ongoing, it's chronic, it goes on and on and on. That is a traumatizing situation, because and again, you and I have talked about this before, but the listeners are not probably aware of this as much. But stress in and of itself is not such a bad thing. Stress is an inevitable part of everyday life. Like I said, I was talking about running up the stairs. That's a stressor. Not eating for 6 hours is a stressor. Giving a presentation is a stressor. Every time Rick gives a sermon, it's still a stressor,
Right.
even though he's very comfortable doing it. It's a challenge.
Responds to that stress.
Exactly. But the difference is he knows the day it's going to happen. There's some controllability because he knows he'll do better if he practices and he gets it, prepares. And this moderate, controllable, predictable stressor literally makes you resilient. It makes your stress response system stronger and more flexible. So the degree of stress he experienced the first time he gave a sermon versus the 50th time is different. And he'll keep stretching himself in different ways to keep growing. But that's what can happen with stress if there's some controllability, moderation, and predictability. Yeah. Now, the challenge with a parent of someone with mental illness is if stress is present chronically and it has episodic, not little moderate stresses, it's huge stressor. And then if you feel like you have no control over it, that leads to the vulnerability, the overreaction, the oversensitivity. So the key for parents, there's two things that are important, I think. One is to kind of sit down and look at the things in your life that you worry about and that bother you, and try to put them into two buckets. Can I control this? And it's no. And then there are things you can control, like, okay, I can control when I go to bed, I can control when I exercise, I can control certain aspects of my week schedule because I'm gonna go to my book club, I'm going to go to church. So you begin to realize that you have to intentionally seek out and follow through with those things that you have control of.
That's good.
And those are some of the first things that we jettison, right?
Yeah.
Because we're so worried, we're so overwhelmed, we're so tired, we're like, oh, forget it. But see, what happens is then you start to, the balance between the uncontrollable and the controllable starts to go in the direction of the uncontrollable. So find the things that you can control and be disciplined to adhering to them. And then the second thing that's really useful in that process is to develop some sort of cognitive ritual, whether it's prayer or meditation or some intentional process where you do a review of those things that you're worried about that you can control, and you just have to let them go. Now, if you believe in God, if you have a belief, you can say, this is in God's hands. This is in fate's hands. This is in the world's hands. I care what happens to you, but I cannot control so many aspects of that. And so the more you practice that, the more you're giving up the control. You're not giving into that sort of preoccupying your bandwidth, your availability to think. And then the third thing that we do, and I'm going to show these slides again just for a second, because I want to help people understand why I make this recommendation, because initially it seems kind of weird. But I'm going to recommend that people develop and practice some form of what we call somato, which is body, and sensory is your senses, eyes, ears, nose, taste, movement, all that kind of stuff. So let me explain this diagram here a little bit. So here's our typical upside down triangle. Down here's the lower, the brainstem, up here's the cortex. And what we want to do is these core regulatory networks that are down here, we want them to quiet down. We want them to sort of be less reactive, less overactive.
And what do you mean by that exactly? What are those core regulatory, just specifically you're talking about? Which parts of
that lower part of the brain? Remember the norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin systems that originate low in the brain and kind of go all over? We want those to be quiet. We want to quiet them down. And so one of the things that we know about the brain, the organization of the brain, is that when you do something that activates a neural network, that's the only way that you can change it, right? So like if I want to learn how to play the piano, I can't just think about it, and I can't just watch a video of people playing the piano. In order to literally build into my brain and change the piano playing part of my brain, I've got to play the piano. So I've got to move my fingers. And if you want to change the stress regulatory part of your brain, you've actually got to stimulate it. You got to activate it. But you want to activate it in a way that's moderate and that's not dysregulating, that you have control over, right? So keep that in mind while I just talk about this slide a little bit. So one of the great things that the human brain does is, and it helps you make sense out of the world, is that as you're growing up, even starting in utero, you're getting incoming input from the visual world, from you hear things, you touch things, and these things come into your brain separately. They come in through different pathways, but ultimately they connect up. And when you hear something at the same time, you see it again and again and again, literally your brain connects. It makes synaptic connections, and you now have a basically you've made sense out of the world. You've seen a dog 1,000,000 times, and you've heard the bark 1,000,000 times, and now your brain knows that when you hear a bark but you don't see the dog, there's a dog somewhere. And when you see a dog but it's not making a sound, you know that thing can bark. And so that's how your brain makes sense out of the world. It makes associations between things that co-occur, and it does that with everything. So you associate a certain tone of voice with kindness. You associate a certain gesture with positive, gentle touch versus a poke, which it has a different set of associations. That's not a very nurturing way to touch somebody. So that's how you make sense out of the world. Through all of these experiences, your brain weaves together and makes associations. Now, in utero, when you are in the womb, you are organizing particularly this lower part of the brain. Remember, that's the part of the brain that develops, right, early in utero. And it's also the part of the brain where these important stress systems originate. So in utero, you're getting continuous, non-stop input from auditory and through tactile rhythms that are from maternal heart rate. So you're continually getting and that happens the entire time your brain is organizing in utero. At the same time, from your body, you're getting these signals that say, I have enough calories. I'm 98.7. I'm not thirsty because I'm in liquid, So you're getting these signals from your body that say, I'm regulated, I'm safe, I'm regulated, I'm safe, I'm regulated, I'm safe. And that gets connected to pattern, repetitive, rhythmic, somatosensory activity, right? So when we take a baby and we rock them at that frequency later on, that calms them down because their stress response gets the signal, oh, that I'm safe, I'm regulated. Even though I feel hungry, I feel safe because you're moving me that way. And so later on, when before I give a talk, I pace around, and after I look at the frequency of pacing, it's the same pacing that I was rocked at as a baby. And I might sort of, people that do stereotypies, people that do this kind of stuff or rock, it's always at either the frequency or the submultiple of the frequency of primary resting heart rate of their mother. And so one of the greatest tools we have to calm us down, to help us regulate, is to use some form of somatosensory regulation. And now different people, as you grow up, you sort of develop different preferences. Some people find swimming or walking or listening to music or dancing, or some people have smaller haptic stuff with their hands. You do needlework or they do other things, but every single one of those things, if you look at and analyze the rhythm of those activities, they're pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activities that are using those same frequencies. So now here's what you can do. And I'm going to close this off for a second. Stop sharing. So here's what you can do is that you can look at your day and you can think about your life. What do I do when I get overwhelmed? Oh, I love to go taking a walk makes me feel better. And so one of the big, I don't want to say it's a mistake, but one of the things that people tend to do with these self-regulatory things that help them feel better is they just do it once.
Yeah.
Like I'm going to go for a walk. But if you start the day and you say, all right, I'm going to walk for 5 minutes, and then I'm going to jump into whatever I do for the day. Or I'm going to learn how to do 3 minutes of deep breathing, because breathing is one of the most important regulatory ways to get to that part of the brain too. It sort of activates vagal, the proper part of the vagus to make you regulated. So we've become big fans of what we call dosing and spacing. And what that means is even if you start very small, you say, all right, I'm going to take 4 minutes every hour, and that's my time, no matter what. And during those 4 minutes, I'm either going to pull out my needlework, or I'm going to put my phone aside and I'm going to do deep breathing, or I'm going to get up and walk for 4 minutes. And you'd be surprised how far you can go in 4 minutes, whether it's on a treadmill or just walking down the block. The more you do that, you'll find that you are really providing for yourself doses of controllable, moderate stressor that will begin to create a better regulated you. And that will clear your brain for better thinking, and it will start a virtuous cycle. It'll break that negative cycle, and it will help you start a more virtuous cycle where you'll be able to be present during these hard times without unraveling. And anyway,
I love that phrase. I have not heard you use that phrase either. Virtuous cycle. I like that. You taught me about dosing and spacing during COVID when we were also isolated, and life was just so crazy for everybody. But that dosing and spacing, and I have applied that and found that so helpful in regulating myself. And so one of the things, I'll steal one of your lines as we move to maybe talking about how to help our loved ones, is you talk about how a dysregulated adult can never help regulate a dysregulated child. Or
exactly.
I'm guessing it's pretty similar that dysregulated adults have a hard time regulating each other too.
Absolutely. Well, hey, everybody, just think for a minute about anybody's relationship, right?
Yeah.
Once you get it, if you both start a little bit, even a conversation about like cooking, and you're both a little dysregulated, that can end up in a co-escalating thing where your cortex disappears and you say things you regret, and later on you have to repair that.
Well, that's so applicable to the situation where many of our parents have adult children. Probably more have adult children than adolescents. And so they are constantly faced with, that is one of the things that has changed my life. When I say what I've learned from you has changed my life, that is one of them, that I never could figure out why. I had a hard time even in marital conflict, if both of us, as you say, were dysregulated, and then getting to the place where we could talk, where we really were calm and getting to the things that we really needed to talk about, and how that then affected my parenting, particularly with Matthew, because he could get so out of control and outrageous in the things that he said or his points of view. And I would just respond, my body and my brain would respond in the same way. And pretty soon, neither of us were, making any sense, and it would just go so poorly. And when I say I want to redo some of those relationships, it's because of what I've learned about that. If I can regulate myself, that I have such a greater chance of helping if that was typically was my son who was not regulated. So talk to us just briefly about that. Yeah. And then especially as that might even apply to siblings, like other other
Yeah.
family members in the home, that I think that what happens to our other kids is it's like the effect of secondhand smoke. You know,
Yeah.
they are not
Yeah.
necessarily the ones with the mental health challenge, but they are inheriting the trauma, inheriting the negative effects in their own bodies, and then they get dysregulated, and that helping our other children when maybe another child that is just probably one of the
Yeah.
greatest questions that these parents might have.
Yeah. And it again, it's one of those under examined but crucially important parts of this. I've had a couple of situations where there were very seriously mentally ill children, and the parents, in a very loving way, poured a ton of attention into that child. But of course, what that means is they weren't going to the games of the other child. They weren't literally, and the sad irony in one of these cases is that the child who committed suicide was the child who didn't have any mental illness, but was always felt marginalized, minimized, unseen, and
That is a
clearly
grief
did.
to parents. That is
Yeah.
a grief to know that our other children are suffering
Yeah.
because we have someone else maybe at the center. And it's so hard when your child has severe needs. It's
Yeah.
hard to ignore those needs and adequately care for emotionally your other
It's
children.
exactly. And it really, it is, I say this a lot about the modern family in the West. We put unrealistic demands on just the nuclear family. You know, human beings are much more relational creatures. We're intended for growing up in community. And I think by, you know, the westernized version of family has just become relationally too small to be able to tolerate some of these sort of challenges when there's a child that struggles. This is kind of where you really want grandmas and grandpas and aunties and neighbors and everybody to kind of help step up and distribute some of the caregiving burden, both for the child with serious mental illness, but to make sure that the children that don't have it also are getting their needs met and getting, so they feel special, and they you know, you can minimize and buffer some of this stuff. It's hard though. I mean, we ask parents to be like so many things for so many kids. It's just really an unfair burden.
Yeah.
And what I would recommend, what I would say is that it's just, if again, this is one of those things where you want to think about dosing and spacing. That you have to, first of all, you have to forgive yourself. Don't be hard on yourself. I mean, you are a single human being. You have strengths, you have limitations, and you're doing your very best. But it will help you if you parse out and say, listen, I am going to intentionally give this time and give myself fully to child A on the schedule. You know, I'm just going to do that. We are going to have our special times. And in those times, I'm going to be real frank. I'm going to say, listen, I know it's hard. You know, it's hard. Timmy's always blowing up family meals, and he gets so much of our attention, and it wears us out. And sometimes I can't do everything that I want to, but use words. See, their cortex will be open. He use words. Now, you may, in the beginning, as you start this, you may feel a lot of anger coming out about this. That,
Yes.
oh, you really want to hear what I have to say? Here's what I have to say. And if you can stay regulated and not get too defensive and absorb that like a sponge a little bit, then the next time around it'll be a little easier, and the next time around it'll be a little easier. But don't give up, because the more they kind of vent on you, the more that indicates that, yeah, you need to do this. I need to have intentional, protected time with this child. And again, you know, I always feel terrible saying this kind of stuff, because I know the reality. I mean, there may be a single parent out there listening with 3 or 4 kids. And here I am telling them to do all of this stuff on top of working and on top of everything else that they're being asked to do. And I don't mean to add. What I want to encourage people to do is to look at their week and see, can I parse out protected moments for me? Can I parse out protected moments for my partner? Can I parse out protected moments for my children that aren't having the serious mental illness? Because all the rest of the time, I'll have lots of time where I'm focusing on the child that's struggling. And the hard part about the child that's struggling is this. If you remember what I said about sort of that when they are dysregulated in their cortex, you could spend hours and hours and hours with them, and it's as if you weren't even there. That's the frustrating thing, is that you spend more time with that child than any other child. And it's more heartbreaking. You think about them more, and their perception is, you don't care about me.
That's right. You're never there for me.
Right.
Sometimes we hear those things. You're never there for me,
or
or
you never listen to me.
You never listen to me, or they'll even say you spend more time with, child B or C, when you're thinking, what? Are you kidding me? Do you know how many hours a day, a week I'm talking to you, working with you, meeting your needs, whatever? It just can be, it can be so chaotic and so painful. And as you said, leaving you with this sense of what you're doing is never enough. It's never enough. I think that there is I think we all need hope that we can keep going, because you get to the place of where you've given and you don't see a change. And like I said, sometimes you'll know there's only going to be a small window, of maybe your child is going to be stable for a while, and then they're going to relapse again in one way or the other, if it's either through substance use or just the cyclical nature of their illness, or something is going to put them back into that place of that pit, that low period. And so you're just trying to grab for the good moments, while you can. So I love, just as we wrap up, I love that you're so hopeful. You say all the time that healing, and by this, I know you don't mean like everything's perfect, but that our brains can get better. And that we can break patterns and habits, and we can learn how to regulate ourselves in such a way that the stress in our lives is mitigated to a certain degree. And you are just so hopeful about that. What would you, just as we close, what would you say kind of in or along those lines to these parents who are listening to us?
Okay, I think I'm glad that you feel that I am hopeful, and I'm glad that comes across, because I know that what I also am is I'm empathic. I mean, I understand this is brutally hard existence. And I think it's so important. I think the most hopeful thing is that you need to realize that you don't have to do this journey alone. There are always people who will walk with you in your pain. And by doing that, it sort of distributes that a little bit. So that's, for me, the most hopeful thing. And this is why I love your ministry and what you do, is that when you are part of a community of faith, that's one of the biggest roles is to, you're not out there trying to necessarily change or persuade, but just I'm going to be with you. That's really how we get through this stuff.
It is being together. I love that. And thank you for your time today. Thank you for sharing your magnificent slides. I'm going to memorize them one of these days. They've just been so helpful to me. And so those You Breathe parents who've gotten to hear Dr. Perry, you'll love his book, because it will take these things that we've talked about and explain them even in more detail, and get the audio, because it really is like listening to him and Oprah have this really engaging and amazing and tender conversation about trauma and the brain and resilience. So thanks, Dr. Perry. And
thank you, Kay.
Parents, we will see you again in December on our next call. I think that's going to be December 8th. Stay tuned. We'll promote that, but we'll see you soon.